Hello, it's Pete again. I'm doing a wrap up for everything I read during March of the March on the Rails, which is 6 books, 4 novels, and 2 travel books. Um, Probably do them all in one video, even though it'll be kind of long because who cares? No one watches these anyway. Um, so, first, I read two, like I said, 2 travel books. They're both by Paul Theroux. Paul Theroux. Paul Theroux. Been saying Thoreau all my whole life, but his son has a documentary out on toxic masculinity. Looks like it would be the greatest documentary and the most important documentary produced in 2022. Too bad it's 2026. But anyway, I learned that the name is Theroux, plus talking to other people. Anyway, we did this uh, a group read, so I ended up talking about it a lot on Voxer, and then I followed up with this book. This is his second book. These were both written in the 70s. This one was his first travel book, 72 or something like that. This one's published in 79. I bought this because I went to a bookstore here in Cuenca, Ecuador, called what's it called? Christina's Bookstore, I think, where they have a lot of used books. And they published they put photos of their new arrivals on Facebook, on their Facebook page. So I saw this for some reason. I thought this was the book we were going to read. Just from the picture, I just noticed the name. And so I went there to get it. And then when I got there, I realized it was actually, this is a separate book, but I made the kid um, dig for it and everything. So I didn't want to I didn't want to not buy anything, so I bought it anyway, which was good because this is relates more to the region I'm in. He is in Ecuador a little bit in this book, so that was interesting. He met some Ecuadorian writers, 3 of them, and had a meal with them, which he tolerated pretty well for Paul. Paul is not the most pleasant guy to be around, in my opinion. He's not a great travel companion. What I did get out of these books, he is a really good writer, though. These books, both of them, are very easy to read, and they're interesting in the descriptions of the travel and stuff. And his ulterior motive may be to prevent anybody else from ever wanting to travel. He doesn't seem to enjoy himself very much, but you kind of get the sense that he really doesn't enjoy anything. He is also a huge snob. Um, so he's not a very likable person, which is fine because the book has other qualities, especially, I really hated the first 75% of this. Then in this book, he goes from London through down the Orient Express. These are in the dark days of the 1970s. So the Orient Express is not a luxury train anymore. It's kind of a junky train. Of course, now it's been renovated, and now it's like, I don't know, $30,000 a ticket or something. What's going on with this WhatsApp application? Oh, it went away. Okay. I got some kind of notification on the screen. I don't know if it'll interfere with the video. I hope not. But yeah, so you get to see a different sort of point of view, a different time in travel. I was traveling myself around this time for the first time in my life. That didn't occur to me till just now, but he there's something on one of these pages I marked, I think. Forget it. It had me thinking about what is a likable protagonist, what is an unlikable protagonist. Why don't I care? Why does it seem more difficult? Spend time with an author telling you their own adventures. Um, Whereas many novels are heavily autobiographical. Many mainstream novels, at least, are heavily autobiographical. If you think of like, Bukowski, he had a character in who appears whenever Bukowski appears in his own stories, his own first person stories and novels. He identifies himself as a man named Hank Chinaski, and Hank and which is a name similar to Bukowski, kind of same kind of probably Polish extraction. And he's clearly writing about stuff that he's talked about in interviews and things, being very autobiographical. For example, his first novel is called Post Office, where the character Hank Chinaski works at the post office for 14 years, wanting to be a writer, and then finally quits so he can pursue it, which is exactly uh, Bukowski's own story. Even sometimes in his poems, as far as I remember, if somebody refers to him in his poems, they refer to Chinaski, not Charles Bukowski. To make it even more closer, people in Bukowski's life called him Hank, not Chuck or Charles or anything like that. He was always called Hank. His name was only Charles on the books. So you could say that the construct is more the author, Charles Bukowski, than the character Hank in his books. Um, and other stuff is thinly disguised. I mean, there's one of his later books which is not that good. It's called Hollywood, and it's about the making of the movie Barfly and the setup of it. And you can tell exactly who every person is. You can tell who Sean Penn is. You can tell who Barbet Schroeder, the director, is, and you can tell who Sean Penn wanted to be in it at one time, and the person who got the role was Mickey Rourke. You can tell who that is. You can tell who Madonna is because she was dating Sean Penn at the time. I think her character's named like Roxana or Shoshana, and she's a pop star. And um, but so there's that very very thin removal, and you have the other when people write a memoir, and I guess the most famous example still is A Million Little Pieces by James Fry, although there have been some others that have come out recently where people just lie in their memoirs to make a better story. Because if you can tell a story like that, like A Million Little Pieces about your drug addiction, everything like that, and exaggerate, and make it really, and make the stories really interesting, you can sell a lot more than you could as a novel by an unknown novelist. But so Paul Theroux's kind of in the middle. There's a quote in one of these things. There's a quote from Graham Greene reviewing The Great Railway Bazaar, where he's here it is. Okay, Great Railway Bazaar. Here's a quote from Graham Greene. It's interesting that he gave him a quote for his book because Paul Theroux says rather kind of an unkind thing about one of Graham Greene's books in there, but obviously Graham Greene didn't mind. He's got a thick skin, I guess. It was just kind of snippy what he said about the Honorary Consul, the book The Honorary Consul, which is a good book, and this is probably a fair criticism. What he said to someone else, he's like, I like the book, but the problem with it is that the 25-year-old doctor sounds like a 50-year-old writer, which is true in my opinion because I read that book years ago, and until I read that sentence, I completely had forgotten that the doctor was young in that book. I thought he was an old man, a middle-aged man. But anyway, Graham Greene says about the Great Railway Bazaar, in the fine old tradition of purposeless travel for fun and adventure, compulsive reading. I don't know what book he read because Paul Theroux doesn't ever have any fun, as far as I can tell, unless it's coming up with like a snotty comeback to a person he thinks is of low intelligence who's boring him on the train. He does a lot of that. It's very interesting how many conversations Paul is able to have with other passengers on trains where the conversation ends with him just coming up with the perfect line that the person that shuts the person up and there's nothing more to be said. Some of these, I think, I had to wonder, are these things he thought in the moment and wished he'd said? Or these things that he only occurred to him later that he wished he said he put in there? He may have said them because in the beginning of this book, first person he meets on the train leaving Boston on the commuter train is an old man who just making small talk. The old man says, they're looking out at the landscape and it's winter, and he says, well, boy, this looks like the Trans-Siberian Express. Because there's snow everywhere. And Paul Theroux, the famous author, who doesn't tell anybody he's an author because he wants to get their honest opinions about stuff and not be put on, says, no, it doesn't. And so the guy's just kind of, okay, whatever, dude, and walks away. And then Paul Theroux kind of feels bad because he snipped at the guy, and then he tries to say something else. Paul Theroux does to kind of get the guy back in the conversation. The guy's like, yeah, whatever, okay, cool. Because he's Mr. Expert, he's Mr. Travel Expert. He's been on the Trans-Siberian Express, so he has a lot of opinions about that. He has very high literary standards, and you can see where that's helped him out because he is a very good writer, and the descriptions of different places will keep you reading. But he's you kind of wonder sometimes, does he ever just like secretly, but just not write down in the book, like pull out the a Travis McGee novel or something? I really doubt it. He's really he only reads important 19th century authors, early 20th century authors. There is since I'm a big Borges fan, I was kind of waiting, because I know at the end of this book he goes to meet Borges. He goes to Argentina and he gets to meet Borges, I should say. Somebody sets it up for him because they know he's a writer, and the Borges likes to meet writers and have them read to him and things because he's blind. He's quite elderly at this time and blind. And I was worried because he has nothing good to really say about anybody. Even the books he's reading, he seems to prefer to read minor works by major authors, and he actually gets an idea to do a lecture. He does some lectures as he's going along. The first 3 books he takes with him are, because he talks about the books he's reading, not in depth. He mentions the title of the book, and then he mentions how it disappointed him, a little bit later. But he brings Pudd'nhead Wilson by Mark Twain, The Devil's Dictionary by Ambrose Bierce, and Wild Palms. I think it's called Wild Palms or The Wild Palms, which is an early Faulkner novel, not considered one of his best. Why is he reading these? Maybe he's just read everything else by these authors. He doesn't like Devil's Dictionary at all, and I wish I had marked the package on that, because the way he criticizes Bierce for writing the Devil's Dictionary, and Bierce's attitude towards the material. The Devil's Dictionary is a really fun book to read. It's a book of it's a dictionary. It's an actual dictionary. It's maybe 100 pages long. I wish I could think of an example right now of definitions, and then this would be a bad example. They're much wittier than this, but it would be like, you would look at the word Congress and it would say like a house full of idiots. But that does not do it justice, because his observations are much pithier than that. But the way Theroux writes about that, he's acting like this is a very unknown book, which it might have been, because I think Dover Press released it as a reissue in the late 70s, when I think that's when people started reading it again. But here's a better cover of it. This is what would have looked like when it came out, the first one. But you can see what a different era we're in. This is what the book looks like now. This is what it would look like. This is probably a pocket book, a regular A format paperback, $2.95. Makes it look like a great adventure story. It's not really. It's him being bored. It's him wishing, it's him just wanting to get to the end of the trip. Not that he particularly wants to go home. He doesn't seem to be like a very. Maybe this is just his writing style, his rather dispassionate kind of writing style, but nothing really affects him much. But he comes off being kind of too cool for school. Uh, but if you read a lot of books, as I do, and as everyone who watches this does, it's still worth reading because of the material he covers and the world that's kind of lost, different kind of travel. He's just kind of a pissy person that you're just glad that you're not stuck on the train with him, where he's writing down everything you say and pretending he's a geography teacher. Um, do I have more to say about those? So, but moving into, or should I cut it short there? Okay, in my next video, I'm going to talk about the 4 novels that I read, train novels, and for the most part, something I discovered that makes train travel a particularly appealing setting for certain type of stories that I'll go into then. I'm sorry about the cliffhanger, but it took me so long to talk about Paul Theroux. Um, so, but I will pick up the thread in the next one when I talk about particularly the first of the 4 novels that I read. I'll try and go through them quickly. But another effect that these Theroux novels had on me is that I want to read a lot more travel fiction. There's a incident in the first book where he meets, I think it's an American he meets, but they're in Russia by this time. He meets this guy who he does kind of admit that he's a writer too. He doesn't usually like to tell people that because he doesn't want them to know that he's going to be judging them, writing, describing them physically in very unflattering ways, especially if they're middle-aged women. Um, and recording all their conversation and then putting his own quips in there. It's all very one-sided, but it has to be because it's his story. But there's a guy who thinks like that's the dumbest thing to do would be write a travel book. Well, like why would anybody read a travel book? Because you can just travel yourself. And Theroux's rejoinder as well. People like to read about sex, but they can have sex themselves, which I really think is a terrible analogy because it's just very glib. I understand what the person's saying about why read a book, especially a contemporary book about traveling. I kind of have the same thing with, well, I guess there are cooking books, books about food, not cooking books, but books about gastronomical subjects, which people like to read, or especially cooking shows. I always feel like why would I be watching this cooking show and watching other people eat? That seems like porn or something. And it reminds me of a Kurt Vonnegut novel. Don't remember which one. Where in it there's a Kilgore Trout short story about a world where everybody eats charcoal. That's the only food that's left. But they go to the theater, to like a porn theater, and they'll watch a film of a guy eating an apple with the apple juice running down his neck and stuff, and they'll close-ups of him swallowing and stuff because they don't have access to tasty food. But I kind of feel that way about that kind of thing. I know some people are really fascinated by it. It's probably a good way to keep your weight down. To me, it would just make me eat even more, just be seeing all these delicious dishes that you can't partake of. And I always kind of felt the same way about travel few other kinds of nonfiction, like restaurant reviews. I thought was always the weirdest thing. Like, I'm not going to go to this restaurant in New York. Why am I reading a review of it in the New Yorker? Or music reviews of music of performances you can't get to, or theatrical reviews. I guess I kind of watch those sometimes, but so maybe this is more a kind of a thing for people who can't travel. However, I'm kind of at the point now where I'm kind of burned out on travel. I think I mentioned that before. I'm so now I want to read about um, other people's travels, and I've tried to do it in the past. There's a few different people I've read that are supposed to be really great that I haven't really pulled me in, but I want to try and read um, some of the Mark Twain travel books, Innocents Abroad and Around the Equator, I think it's called, or and I've got some books. I've got some ebooks collections of Henry James, and I believe they have his travel books in there too, Italian Days, and I think there's another one which I had never considered reading before, even though I like Henry James's fiction. I never considered that I would ever read his travel books, but maybe I'll try one of those just to see how they are, because I did get kind of a taste from that. So you can credit Paul for that, giving me a taste for travel fiction, even though I don't particularly want to read his anymore. And he wrote a bunch of them. He wrote one, two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight by the time this edition was published, but I can't tell when this edition was published. It doesn't give the dates of subsequent printings. There's been like 30. This edition was published originally in 1980, but it lists 30 printings since then. So you know, um, so this was published much later. So yeah, they were worth reading. Uh, if you can stand to be around a person who's kind of pissy. Um, the funny thing I wanted to say, I got kind of off track about his complaints about the Devil's Dictionary by Ambrose Bierce, is he really doesn't like Bierce's glib, sort of snide, sort of cynical take on everything. And I thought, this is a perfect self-review, Mr. Theroux, which is probably why he didn't like it very much, because it's so much like his own style of writing. At least in these books, haven't read his fiction. I've seen the two movies, which were both pretty good movies, and probably worth reading the novel someday, of Saint Jack, which I think is very underrated, not very well known. Peter Bogdanovich movie with Ben Gazzara, and then the more famous, better known Mosquito Coast with Harrison Ford and Helen Mirren. Anyway, so I probably won't watch this again. I remember them well enough that I probably wouldn't be interested in the book. So onward to the next stack of books. Okay, talk to you later.